what you should look for is stop looking for GMO, non-GMO.
Yep.
It's organic or non-organic.
Yes.
That's really what the easy decision to make for you. Not having to worry so much on what you should be consuming.
It's good, especially from a consumer standpoint.
You look at Bayer. Bayer is the producer of aspirin. Bayer bought Monsanto. Monsanto is one of the largest seed companies in the world.
Another mic drop.
You have another issues, and what then? Of course, you found that Bayer bought CRISPR. CRISPR is the gene editing technology.
I did not know that.
Yes. So now you have one of the best gene editing tools on the planet in use for their pharmaceutical and food company products.
Those sneaky little guys. That's where you have to see what's going in your body and what you're surrounding yourself with. So that then comes into the aspect of what are we consuming crop-wise from a foundational setting.
Welcome to the Functional Code, your go-to source for decoding optimal health. Join Dr. Addy and Dr. Jace as they break down the science behind pain, performance, longevity, and more, making complex concepts easy for you to understand and apply in your life. Your journey to a healthier you begins with understanding the Functional Code.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Functional Code. We are excited to bring to you guys today a new episode on GMO versus non-GMO crop, and also organic versus non-organic crops. I think this is a big area of argument still, and I think there's a lot of governing bodies / powerful entities out there that control what we maybe think or understand about these topics. And so we're excited to kind of dive into this today as in-depth as possible, and hopefully what you gain today is a better understanding of what is really things you should think about before you choose which food to consume, and maybe how that looks moving forward. So as always, I am Dr. Addy.
And I am Dr. Jace. So yeah, we're going to be diving into GMOs. We're going to be diving into organic versus non-organic, the influence on allergens, and even some court cases to give you guys a better understanding of how deep some of this goes, like Dr. Addy said. Also, Doc's going to be diving into a few of his real-life experiences and how everything kind of molds and gels together with especially these genetically modified organisms or GMOs from there. So I guess it would be ideally first a start of what are GMOs, and then we can get into other specifics as we go from there in terms of organic, non-organic, and then the governing bodies, and then break it down from there on that side. So when we look at genetically modified organisms, these can be anywhere from plants, animals, microorganisms, and it's anything that is genetically engineered to change and or help grow, but it affects different areas in terms of crops. It affects everything in terms of animals, plants around the area, especially with water wastes, clearing out some of these farmlands, and there's a lot more influence on some of the stuff that we may realize as well. So when you hear GMOs, it's way more harmful than people realize on that side. So when we look at organic versus non-organic, organic foods are processed through strict guidelines that promote balance and pretty much help conserve biodiversity to avoid synthetic substances. So more or less for organic foods, there's no synthetic chemicals, there's no genetically modified organisms or GMOs. It helps the animal welfare, and it helps for natural practices with crops rotation as it changes from season to season to help for the soil diversity and biome on that side. Now, when you look at the bigger companies and how they influence to have more yield on some of their crops, there's a push-pull. So yes, it may cause less money, but it's doing more harm to our body, which we'll dive into that as well. And then just even add into non-organic foods, there's a lot more preservatives found in the food as well. So when you look at who is governing all of these organic, non-organic, GMOs, non-GMOs, that is all regulated through pretty much 3 different entities. The United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA, And their role ensures that the GMOs are, particularly for genetic engineered crops, are safe to grow and don't propose a risk to the plants or agriculture. There's other divisions under that as well. And then there's that Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. And they also look at GMOs for humans and animal consumption. And they oversee foods, additives that are added into all these products that can affect all of us. And then the last one is Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. And they look at regulating the GMOs that have been modified to produce these pesticides or protect against pests around the area. So you can kind of see how everything is gelling together, but in terms of different scopes on where they look at for these GMOs, organic, non-organic, all that. So I'll put together and I'll put up on the screen the differences, organic versus non-organic. You can kind of go through the list in terms of the farming methods. Organic is much better for everything, environment-wise, human consumption, much more than we may realize on that side of things.
Yeah.
So,
and I think most people understand that. I'll get to a study a little bit in here that shows they did a study across 20 countries and asked what people felt about GMO crops, and over 50% said they believe it's unsafe. And this is just a general survey. Yeah, it was just over 20 countries. They literally asked, and they said, what do you feel? Do you think they're safe or not? And most, over half, think that they're not safe. Now, it's tough because you go into the literature and there's a lot of clashing of that. But is that literature the only literature we're allowed to see? Is there literature out there that we haven't read? We haven't gotten to read.
I'm sure.
We don't know this yet. And so you have these ginormous agencies that have spent a lot of money on studies to show a certain outcome, and I'll be getting to those in a little bit. But I think people talk, and I think the biggest thing that we hear a lot about, and this one I hear all the time, is I went over to Europe and I was eating some of their food and I didn't feel as bad. And I know that there are so many people out there that have heard that before. And that story doesn't just pop up one or two times, because that story is continually heard. I've heard it now many times from patients. That's not nothing. And that's where I think people are starting to question the validity of these practices. And I used to think that back in the day there was this. It was called the 10 million meal study. I think is how much it was. Is the 10 million or the 10 billion? I can't remember. But anyway, they tracked. This study showed, and it was a retrospective study, so it wasn't a very high quality study. They basically just looked at families that ate organic and families that ate GMO. I mean, that was the best that they could do.
Okay.
And this study was, I remember it was huge. It came out and they're like, they tracked the habits and health of these families versus the other, and there was zero differences. These families got just as sick as these families. There was no change in illness. There was nothing like that. And it, killed the idea that there was any real concern with GMO crops or foods in that case. Now, over time, we started to get the argument of, well, it's not so much the GMO, it's what you have to do to maintain a GMO crop, and that's using pesticides. And that is where people don't understand the harm that can come from having to use pesticides. And of course, then you talked about the soil contamination and then the runoff and all these other things that come with it too. So, and of course, when you look into some of the GMO organisms that have been changed for not only bad but good, because there are times where these changes have created a lot of allergenic changes, and they've talked about that. There was a Brazil nut that they modified, and it caused a very high amount of allergic reactions in consumers, and they had to pull it off the market. So there's these things that have been seen. Obviously, these organizations try to make sure nothing like that happens, but if it does, then they're there to make sure it is pulled off the market. But it doesn't mean that there aren't still organisms out there, plants, food, even animals. You look at, I'll get to a point here of the salmon that are genetically modified to grow to full adulthood in half the time.
Wow.
of a typical one. And I just got done watching a video of a gentleman who picked apart an entire salmon. He cut it in half and he rolled it over, and he picked apart just the inconsistencies with the health of the meat that he's used to seeing comparative to a naturally grown salmon to full size. And he goes, if you take a look at the ribs, and he kind of pulled them away from the meat, and he's like, this shouldn't happen. He goes, in a healthy membranous salmon, you should not have to worry about the ribs basically falling apart or away from the body when you're trying to fillet.
Wow.
And he's like, I could pretty much pull all of these bones straight out. And he goes, that's not how it should work. He goes, there should be healthy tissues overlying and overlapping all of this, and I usually have to pick it out one by one with tweezers.
Yeah.
And he's like, the coloration changes, and he goes, even the taste. And he's like, there's a lot of fatty growth with some of those fish. And he goes, and this is true, we know this, toxins are what follow fat.
Yep.
And fish are known for having higher levels of heavy metals anyway. And he goes, because of the fat quality in a lot of these fish, he goes, it's so high. He goes, most salmon should have anywhere between, I think, 4 to 8% of fat on them. And some of these higher fatty, quickly grown, genetically modified salmon have anywhere from 15 to 34% fat quantity. And he goes, toxins are going to follow the fat, and you're going to get a way less quality meat, and it's going to be worse for you. So it's not only in crops, it's happening in animals too.
So you can eat well, think you're eating well, but whether it's storage in, I know we just did an episode on plastics.
Yes.
In a container.
Yes.
Oh, I'm eating this fish on a consistent basis. But what I think that, especially from a provider standpoint and also consumer standpoint, did you get it in a can? If so, yeah, look at the plastics. Did you get it from a place that is genetically modifying some of these organisms or feeding certain animals at a larger quantity for a larger amount of fish, animals, and how it's affecting there? It just gives us a good perspective.
Yes.
Interesting.
And so I used to not to be so worried about GMOs, and to this day I'm not quite sure I even still agree with the arguments that a lot of these countries and companies are making, because I think we're still not seeing the full picture, and it's tough for us to really understand. But I do fully believe that the management of GMOs with the amount of pesticides used are what going to create a lot more harm for people.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there are some genetic modifications that have been created to truly help this world.
Yes.
And I kind of have a few here. I maybe won't go into all of them, but for example, the Hawaiian rainbow papaya was actually genetically modified to resist what's called the ring spot virus, and it devastated the papaya industry in the 90s. And this GMO actually saved the industry from collapse because it could resist this virus that had basically become widespread in this industry. So, that's such a that's a great, I guess, a show of why GMO science can really help with. And where I'm from, there's land that is very great to grow on, and then there's land that has basically sand in it. I mean, it's very poor quality. And you need what's called a defensive crop. It's a crop that is genetically modified to be more resistant, not need as much water, basically can withstand way worse soil quality. And those are the farmers that will purchase a more defensive crop for the land that they have to grow on, because unfortunately land is very expensive, and farmers don't just have the cash to go and buy the best land, and most of the time all the land is taken. I mean, it's getting to that point now where a lot of that land is the good land is probably taken.
And
so
it's passed down from family to family.
it is,
members.
and you're kind of given what you're given.
Yep.
And every year soil quality is starting to get worse historically. So, that's another important use of GMO modification is being able to have a crop that actually presents yield and you make a profit as a farmer. And a lot of these farmers, as much as they're interested in making sure that, they do the best at what they can do, they want to provide for their families and do their best. So there's got to be when you're thinking about this, you kind of have to think about this big picture, because a lot of people argue that it's the farmers who don't, who should stop being so commercialized and go organic and do the right thing and save the environment. And it's like, you guys have no idea how hard they freaking work to make sure that they have a crop that can yield. And then if they don't, they're done for the year. Like it's just basically collecting the insurance off of the crop, your break even for the year. And that was out of their hands because of weather or hail or something. There's got to be a better treatment towards this industry who has really, saved the world. I mean, we don't understand how much we rely on that. So, taking it from both sides. There are also vitamin-enriched crops like golden rice. So golden rice is really cool because it's modified with beta-carotene, and so basically when we eat it, it gets converted into vitamin A. And it was developed to combat a lot of leading countries that have vitamin A deficiency as an issue in their population. And with vitamin A deficiency, it actually causes blindness in children. So this was just something that they created that they knew that could boost that in humans. NASA has looked at GMO foods for obviously trying to grow on probably horrible planet conditions if we're ever going to be interstellar. We do know that now, however, majority of corn and soy are GMO or modified. Over 90% of corn and soybeans are grown genetically modified, because unfortunately now we're getting even what's called herbicide tolerance with these crops. So the sprays and pesticides they're using, these weeds are resistant to that now, because these weeds are evolving. And they're starting to become resistant to the spray, and so there's plants are evolutionary. They're changing just as animals are.
100%.
And now they're needing to either use a different kind of pesticide or more of it to get rid of these weeds for higher yield, and that is going to pose a problem. More runoff, more issues. If there's still residual pesticides on the crop that they collect, and now we consume that, that's why you should wash your vegetables, wash your fruit. It's not just to get the dirt off it. No, it's to get pesticides off of it.
Smart.
And you should still be concerned about that.
And I'll get probably also why that we can't break down corn products as humans. Most of us. I mean, I never really thought about it from the pesticides, the GMO side of things on that. But I'm really glad that you brought
corn
that up.
allergies and soy allergies, they're a thing. And why is that? Is it because of the pesticide use on them, or is it because they're genetically modified? Absolutely. Is it both? I don't know. I really wish we had an answer so people could at least make that decision for themselves. And I'll get to Europe's stance on this in a little bit, because I think it'll answer that question for you if you're still wondering. Glow-in-the-dark plants. Scientists have created plants that glow in the dark by incorporating genes from bioluminescent organisms, and they're doing this to try to create eco-friendly lighting, which is interesting. Non-browning apples. Arctic apples are genetically modified to resist browning. This is more.
I've heard of that.
This is more aesthetic, I think. I don't think there's actually any benefit of that. It's just they don't like, you got to sell more. Got to sell more food. So you want it to look brown. Now, global GMO bans. So companies like the U.S. and Brazil still heavily use GMOs, but countries like Europe nations have strict bans and labeling requirements due to public skepticism, regulatory concerns. So really what Europe has done is maybe this will be a really quick time to jump into I'll jump ahead a little bit and then I'll pull back to finish this. But so Europe United basically created this 10-year GMO research. Okay. And basically what they found was that GMO crops were no more riskier than conventional crops in this study. They looked at biodiversity, and they said that it's not adversely effective to target organisms such as butterflies or soil organisms if you use GMO crops versus the latter. There was no real likelihood of gene transfer between crops if you use GMO crops. And they are thinking about strategies to enable the coexistence of GMO and non-GMO crops together if obviously they're going to make the change. But what they really were looking at was just the public perception and how divided it was. And they still were concerned with the safety and environmental concerns being primary factors, such as, again, runoff and all the other things that are needed when using GMO crops. So they basically concluded that even though there was no real health risk of using it, consumption just alone, there was no real risk. But how do you need to manage GMO crops, the worries of pesticides, that coming into play, and then there was still just a lot of research that we don't have access to or have seen yet regarding GMO crops. And so they basically said that there needs to be way more regulatory framework for GMOs, and then they kind of started that process. So now their regulations are far stricter on the use of GMOs. Tracing crops over there is very, very strict, making sure you are using little to no pesticides. I'm pretty sure in some countries you cannot use pesticides at all. You can't even use GMOs. I know in Norway, I think you cannot. It's non-GMO and it's organic. So I think for the next 10, maybe 20 years, they'll probably develop a process, and maybe there's research that will come out that will change our minds on things. But they did say that GMO crops could benefit farmers by increasing yields and reduce pesticide costs if, depending on if the GMO crops were created to obviously to grow and be sustainable without as much influence on them. But they still think there's need for ongoing research, and they're going to make sure that everything is safe and effective for use before that they just go gung-ho into GMO use. So that was really where Europe came from as far as making a decision on why they are going to be so strict with GMO crops. And I understand the whole pesticide problem. I mean, that's not an argument for me, and that's always been my explanation to what you should look for is stop looking for GMO, non-GMO. It's organic or non-organic. That's really what the easy decision to make for you. Not having to worry so much on what you should be consuming.
It's good, especially from a consumer standpoint. It's organic, non-organic, especially even if it costs like just a few cents more. Way better for your health.
I mean, a lot of people argue that it's more expensive, and
not that much more though.
I mean, I really think if you were to look at it really hard and try to figure out the numbers, most are gonna have their argument of budget, and always going to be person dependent. But then the argument down the road is, let's say you're saving now but paying more for your health later. There's your wash. That's always my argument. But people don't think that long term, right? But again, I do think you'll feel better. I do think, I mean, Joe Rogan had a really good explanation of all the issues that he had health-wise before he switched to eating wild, grass-fed, caught only in the wild meat versus in the organic foods versus in others. And he said he noticed a difference right away, and he didn't have as many issues. And I know that there's a lot of stories out there similarly. So, but yeah, lastly, GMO salmon grows faster. This is called an aqua bounty salmon. It was genetically modified and approved for human consumption because it grows to market size in half the time of conventional salmon due to an added growth hormone gene. And this is kind of what I was talking about, where you need to really think about those kinds of things. Is faster better? Is bigger better? Exactly. And what's the risk, or what's the trade-off of something like that? So my spouse loves salmon, and we only buy wild caught. So you have farm raised versus wild. That's obviously what you're going to try to choose is wild, and I think it's wild caught in the store. But anyway, so the last thing I added on here was more of a perspective for people. So it's like, what are we going up against when it comes to, especially even with the new administration now taking over. I know we have a lot of big goals with this administration, and I think it's great. Do they know what they're going up against? Probably. They probably have a better idea than we do.
Oh, yes.
But here is what they're going up against. So I took apart really what we think is the entities that govern us and really have a lot of power over us. So the first one is Big Pharma.
Of course.
Big Pharma is estimated to be worth around $1.4 trillion in annual revenue.
And that's a T.
That's a T, and that's a lot.
Trillion.
And that is a lot. But people don't understand about big food. And here's where people get the confusion, because they really think Big Pharma is the issue. And it's not that it's not. It definitely is an issue. But when you look at big food, the global food system is worth 15 trillion. 15 times the amount of Big Pharma.
Wow.
And the U.S. alone does about 1.5 trillion a year. So the food industry is a significant part of the modern production and consumption of everything. Everything.
We have to survive.
Yes. You look at Bayer. Bayer is the producer of aspirin. Bayer bought Monsanto. Monsanto is one of the largest seed companies in the world.
Another
and so
mic drop.
you have another issues. And what then, of course, you found that Bayer bought CRISPR. CRISPR is the gene editing technology.
I did not know that.
Yes. So now you have one of the best gene editing tools on the planet in use for their pharmaceutical and food company products.
Those sneaky little guys.
So you have these things you have to think about. You know, what is going to be happening down the road? You know, who's in bed with each other, and what does that look like moving forward? So, people really, when you take a look at this, it's a lot deeper than we really understood, and
gosh.
there's a lot more to it, and than really what we are have any knowledge of to knowing. I mean, you take a look at some of the larger agriculture communities that have been, you know, in the last administrations in the last 20 years, and a lot of those. I mean, so you take a look at the companies that govern pharmaceutical or healthcare. So many of them have come from big pharmaceutical companies that have been put on these communities. Okay, their job, fight for who they worked for.
Of course.
Laws and litigations, making sure they go for the companies that they used to work for, in favor of. Same thing with agriculture. You have companies like Monsanto, other big food like Kellogg's and General Mills. Their executives were on these committees that now fight for making sure that everything that they can do is legal and they can push as much as they want. This is all real. Like it's happened. You can go on with the websites and look. And pick one of their names. Look at where they came from. You can see it. It's very simple. I did this one time. And so it's not like they're hiding this from us. It's not like there's these secret meetings all the time and we don't know what's going on. It's just in plain sight. It's if you look. It's happening. It's just so big we can't stop it now. And now you need to think more for yourself and realize, okay, what's best for me, and what should I be doing as far as day-to-day consumption patterns, and how do I really take care of myself?
And that's why we're bringing this podcast to light for the awareness aspect.
For sure.
And just dive into how everything is kind of put together. Because, like when I hear some of these big companies, I'm thinking of food, and I'm not even thinking of the connection it's made to the pharmaceutical companies. But it's all a huge cloud over everything, because obviously we need to consume food to live and survive. Sure. But if we're in an environment where naturally it's harming us without us even realizing it, and then other health implications that come from that,
we have a right to know. We have a right to know that.
Agreed.
And so, but when taking a look at the research, maybe that's more anti-GMO in a way, because there isn't much out there, unfortunately. 2022, there was a systematic review that came out that showed the need for more comprehensive studies to determine the safety of GM foods conclusively. So that was their doctored up way of saying there's no real adverse effects or safety issues that we know of. But we definitely need more studies to determine if this is safety conclusively.
I wonder who did those studies.
Yeah, that was an interesting study. So
interesting.
Next one, 2020 survey. This is the study that I had just brought up. Pew Research Center found that a median percent of about 48% of the people surveyed across 20 countries believe GM foods are unsafe to eat, reflecting ongoing public concern. Now they'll argue that that's just from misinformation. You know, most of you just don't understand what's really going on behind the scenes, which again, I'd argue, I think we do. I think we feel it. You know, we're the unhealthiest we've ever been. We're getting unhealthier by the decade. I mean, we're not doing something right. I mean, what is it? Can you help us? Can you help us figure that out? If it's not the food we're eating, then what is it? I don't know.
Especially if we're trying to eat healthy, but we're not realizing that we actually probably aren't.
Right.
That's
testing and regulatory limitations. So critics argue that the current regulatory framework may not require long-term human clinical trials for GM foods, which is now potentially overlooking long-term health effects. So there's a lot of scientists out there that argue that you don't need long-term studies on GM foods. Yeah, there's no real need for that. And
That baffles me.
the Center for Food Safety is who put out this study, showed we are overlooking long-term health effects, not doing long-term studies on these kinds of crops and issues. Now, this is coming from the World Health Organization, which I'm sure we all truly believe anything that they say, but they did note concerns about potential for GMOs to introduce engineered genes into wild populations, which could create instability of those genes and have indirect effects on human health. So it was their very gentle way of saying there could be an indirect effect on human health with the instability of these GMO genes on crops.
They're tiptoeing around
Of course,
everything.
but they said it.
Yeah,
I mean, they
exactly.
pointed it out. They didn't deny it.
Fancy way of saying it, though.
And then the Genetic Literacy Project, which you haven't looked into that, that's actually pretty cool. But it said multiple experts in the field emphasize the necessity for long-term safety tests relevant to human health and should be conducted independently of GMO vested interests to address potential risks adequately. So what they're saying, what research do we have and what are we listening to mostly and who has created it and who has funded it? Should we maybe create GMO studies that aren't vested from a entity that has control or a biased interest in obviously why they would be putting out that research? So
For sure.
yeah, that's the best that I had on the ins and outs of GMOs, understanding really, and I could go into more here. You really take a look at the research I'm giving you is the research that probably has been funded, by, like I said, by, these bigger companies. The nutrition differences, there really isn't much that we've seen. Overall, the compositions were similar in these studies. Non-GMO soybeans contained a little bit higher levels of isoflavonoids and saccharides, where GM soybeans had higher concentration of unsaturated fatty acids. The variations were minor and really didn't imply any significant nutritional disadvantage. You looked at this 21-year study found modified corn increased yield, decreased levels of certain toxins, which was interesting. I think that was the argument of less pesticide use maybe. No significant difference in grain quality measured by protein, lipid, fiber content. Some studies observed slight differences in GMO versus non-GMO when it comes to calcium, potassium, and zinc in one study for corn. But really, nutritional comparisons between genetically engineered, non-genetically engineered crops showed no significant differences. Rigorous testing has found no evidence in increased allergenicity or toxicity from these foods. Long-term studies have not yet revealed health risks associated with consuming GE crops. So while public skepticism remains, the scientific consensus supports safety, and really they're really looking at combating malnutrition in developing regions, and that's why they're continuing to push for GMO crops. The report emphasized the importance of transparent communication, environmental monitoring, ongoing research, which I think Europe is doing, to ensure long-term safety and efficacy of GE crops. So this was taken from, I think, 5 or 6 different studies, and I kind of just summarized it for everyone. And I don't think it's the nutrition that we're worried about, it's what comes with it. And again, it's back to organic versus non-organic and all the things that we need to think about. Environmental impact, I don't think I need to really go into too much. It's really just the pesticide use that we would be worried about versus, and biodiversity change that comes with chemicals in the soil, water runoff, all those kinds of things.
And Doc, you were saying before we got on about the effects of the soil, especially in Arizona versus up north with some of the chemicals that is involved with it and how long that could possibly stay in the soil. Do you want to touch on that a little bit?
So Dr. Allen was a guest of ours, one of the ones prior, and he had mentioned, because I had asked him, do a lot of Arizonians have heavy metal issues? Do you see, does he see that in practice? And he said yes, because I don't think it's used now, but prior they sprayed what was called arsenic, which is, I believe it's a natural chemical found in plants, I think, if I have to look that up. But it's horrible for your body. It's a heavy metal.
Yes.
And they used to spray it on cotton to help ripen the plant before yield, before they took it out of the ground. And arsenic is really, really harmful to your body, especially in high amounts. And so, what pesticide use that they would have to use, and if you were to use arsenic back in the day, I think that was technically considered a natural pesticide. But now they've banned pesticides such as arsenic and I think a few others just because they now know that it's harmful. So here's another thing to think about. It's like, okay, what natural pesticides are we using now that we're gonna be pulling off the market in 10 years?
Exactly.
Or what real pesticides are we using that are still using that are incredibly harmful? Glyphosate is one of them. And that's
yes,
going to be
we'll
something
get
that
into that.
obviously I'll get into. But the impact not only on the crops, the soil, and let alone humans and animals can't be argued with when it comes to pesticides.
Yeah.
And that's really where we need to think long and hard about how we can change that.
Especially for generations to come and
sure.
soil quality.
For sure. There's some economic impact on farmers. Lastly, that I kind of rounded off here. We talk about there are benefits to certain GM crops such as cotton. It just showed increased profits for farmers using GM crops. I kind of threw that one in there, obviously, because you want to make sure that if you're going to take up an industry, you want to make a living off of it.
Exactly.
And I'm a capitalist. I get it. Absolutely. I mean, hey. However, now we talk about seed dependency. And so that's something that we kind of talked beforehand. So for those of you that don't know, there are certain companies that have what we would call a monopoly over a lot of the farmers, especially in the United States and in other parts of the world if they have to use their crop. But there is certain editing tracing gene tools that these companies have that they put in their seeds. And if you were to plant the seeds for the year using, let's just say, Monsanto's crop, they now have the ability to track, and they know that you used their seed. They can take a sample of it and they know it's their seed. Now what they do is they change that every year. And so most farmers, this is back in the day, would plant a crop. They would store half of the collected crop for next year because they would use that as seed to make sure that they could have an effective crop for next year. And then they would either sell or consume the other half. That's a general consensus of how it worked. However, now you plant, you collect all of it, you sell it, and then you purchase next year's seed and you repeat. If you collect any of the year's seed and store it for next year, that is considered illegal. There are laws now in place that you cannot do that.
That is baffling.
Yes, and Monsanto is one of the companies that my guests did a very good job of, talking to government agencies and making sure that, they can protect their intellectual property. It's that's what they call it. That's one of the reasonings.
Oh my God.
So their patented seed technologies cannot be taken. There are third world countries who rely heavily on these GMO crops because it is rough to grow in some of these areas. Africa is a big one. A lot of desert areas, and they can't keep any of that crop, which I'm sure they could use if they're not as well off as other areas. So I know that there's been a lot of huge videos that have come out with a lot of these countries, compiling all the Monsanto seed up and burning it, and what would you call not go on strike, but having a really hard issue with the fact that they have to continue to purchase the seed every year from them, and they're starving and not having a lot of success in some of those areas, and they're doing the best that they can. So that's the real issue, in my opinion, with the economic impact. Is some of these farmers can help the land that they have, and truly need more help than just you letting me purchase the seed from you.
That's a really full scope, full picture.
And if you look at some of these seeds, if you look up like a GMO corn seed from Monsanto, it's purple and green. It has some of them have inoculant on them, which is a chemical that allows for easier sprouting in the seed or in the soil.
Yeah.
So it comes with that chemical on it already.
Smart from their side, but
So
dang.
it doesn't look like a real. It doesn't. You think of like a kernel of popcorn before it's popped. You know, you think of it as like, oh, it's brown. There's nothing on it. No, you look up. Go ahead and look up Google a corn seed from GMO. You'll see it looks like a sour gummy, like
Oh
as
my
far as
gosh.
rainbow colorations. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. And then you got a question: is that something we should eat? I don't know. But apparently, if you look at every industry in the United States, says that it's very healthy and safe and should have no issue. I don't know.
Who's saying that?
I should question. I'm going to question that. So
For sure.
so now we kind of get into organic versus non-organic, and I think
Yes.
this is a lot easier to not prove but show why you want to be searching more for organic than non-organic. So the first one I pulled up showed a study of women in the UK found a high amount of reduction of certain cancers with organic food consumption versus non-organic food consumption. So we know already cancer is a big one. That's been very easy to track with organic versus non-organic use, and I'll get to even more in kind of the future studies that I have,
Which I'm sure
once we get into
also-
glyphosate and other things like that.
With like the GMOs on why they don't want to do long-term studies.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid of what they're going to find.
They've probably already done it.
Oh,
we probably already know.
must.
I doubt that we really have no idea. But pro-organic, there's a higher antioxidant, lower cadmium concentration, lower incidence of pesticide residuals in organic grown crops. This was a systematic literature review done. I can't remember what crop that was, but again, environment, you're going to have less runoff. It's going to be way healthier for the soil and biodiversity. You know, pesticide use, you're going to have lower exposure for that. As far as yield, they argue that you can still contribute to the global food security in this one study. And we'll put all this up there for you guys to look at. I think I've done my due diligence to kind of dive into everything with GMO and organic. I kind of want to move on from here. But again, economic change, other than, this one study argued that you can organically farm and be economically viable with even the premium pricing that comes around it. So this was one study that showed that you can still thrive with an organic farm. They argue that maybe it's more labor intensive. This one study showed it actually created more employment opportunities due to labor intensive practices. So, it's labor intensive, but maybe better for the economy moving forward if we can create more jobs.
Got some
One thing to
margins,
think,
probably a little bit, but you still.
one thing to think about there.
Yep.
Soil health, that one's very simple. Just showed way better soil structure and fertility over time with organic farming. Biodiversity supports higher biodiversity in the soil. And then lastly, consumer perception, market demand. Consumers perceive organic foods as healthier and more environmental friendly, which makes sense coming across However, people agree that GMO foods or non-organic are probably generally more affordable and accessible. So we still have a lot of things to take head on with this topic when it comes to consumers, what we believe, what we should know, what we should actually get as far as information to us, and what other things should we really be worried about. So I think you had some great information moving forward, and I have some on really the allergenicity.
Yes.
And I think that one got really kind of skimmed over with some of the bigger studies and bodies of literature. But I think you and I have done a pretty good job of showing some of the things that we should be concerned about when it comes to allergenicity of GMO and other crops. So, Doctor, you want to just jump in a little bit on what you found with the relationship to GMOs and allergens?
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you put some of the stuff in there in terms of how wheat and allergens play into it, and even with crops and allergens as well, especially with more allergies coming about at such a young age for a lot of children. That we're seeing more in America compared to other countries. It has to come from somewhere. So that's when you look at food source, you look at water source, environmental source, and we're starting to see that all these foods can create now different allergens. And to go taking a step back on how they're modifying the seeds on a year-to-year basis, that then brings up the question of how is all this affecting us long term? And obviously, if you guys have been listening as long into this point, you can kind of start putting the pieces together on that side of things. So it is creating these new allergens. It's also exacerbating some of the existing allergens, from whether it's if you have allergies to peanuts, if you have allergies to soy, and you're not able to digest corn. All these things come about for a reason. So when they look at the allergenicity testing, they can do this a couple different ways. They can look at either the protein sequence comparison, so they can kind of see what proteins are similar to known allergens. They can also look at simulated digestion tests to see how these proteins break down in the digestion system as well. And then even looking at animal and clinical studies, the potential and how we're able to reduce some of these allergic reactions for us as a society, I think, is each family has to take this as a huge in comparison to how they want to survive long term. So you as a family have to come together. Should you consume organic versus non-organic? Should you look for labeling on any of the products that you consume? Does it say GMOs? If so, you know that there's probably some health risks long term for the foods that you consume, and these are not some things that you should just brisk over.
Yeah.
These are things that now you definitely need to start taking into consideration, especially teaching your kids, teaching your family that as we're putting this podcast together, and you can kind of see full scope of the long-term implications, not only for the soil and the biodiversity, but for generations to come, that this is going to get worse unless we make a change in some way possible.
Agreed.
So going back to the allergy part of things, what reactions do you notice on either a day-to-day, week-by-week basis? Maybe even doing a little bit of a trial of consuming like a set palette of foods for a whole week, see how your body reacts, your family's body reacts, and then change up the next week, or let's say a month later, do another week with organic and then versus non-organic. See how you feel, document. That'll give you a good understanding and an applicable tool that these things will have effect, and you will feel better organic with non-GMOs.
And I think a lot of people have noticed it. I really do.
Absolutely. So that's where you look on the labels. Like I said, look at for GMOs, non-GMOs. I know we touched on organic versus non-organic. Yes, you probably want to save money, but this is where the education aspect comes in, and knowing that these implications can harm you long-term with all these genetically modified aspects. So that's kind of an overview of how certain allergens can affect how your body processes these foods, and it leads to reactions long term, not only for the foods that we consume, but even in terms of the environments that we surround ourselves with, and how the immune system can fight and combat all these like small things that we might not realize. And we know now that there's only so many white blood cells in our body that can fight off infections and help with our immune system. It's also helping fight injuries. So you want to have this best immune system. You want to have the best environment and potential for yourself long term, and that's where you have to see what's going in your body and what you're surrounding yourself with. So that then comes into the aspect of what are we consuming crop-wise from a foundational setting. So Doc, I'm actually really curious to see how gluten, wheat, and how that plays into the allergens that we consume.
So there's this relationship between wheat and allergies that I think a lot of people understood. The severe ones is called celiac disease. There's also an understanding of what's called hybridized wheat, which is basically wheat varieties that have been changed to over time. And what we've now known is the more hybridized we've gotten, basically from wheat breeding, there has been certain changes with the proteins, but also due to the heavily amount of changing, there's argument that we're not able to digest it as well. It's actually causing worse celiac issues, and we're kind of moving in the wrong direction. And, if you took a look, there was a study that showed 60 wheat varieties were analyzed from 1981 all the way to 2010. And it did show that modern wheat varieties contained slightly less protein than the older ones. The amount of gluten was about the same. There was a decrease in gliadins, which actually is a protein that can be associated with celiac disease, by about 18%. But there was an increase in glutenins by approximately 25%. Now, I would argue that gliadins aren't the only thing that causes or are associated with celiac disease. There's a lot other things, and one of them are these gluten peptides that actually have been shown to also create issues in patients with celiac disease. And so modern wheat breeding, this is another study, showed to have higher concentrations of certain glia alpha 9 and glia alpha 20, and these higher amounts can absolutely cause way more issues in patients with celiac disease. There's also potential between different wheat species, and they break it down called diploid, tetraploid, and hexaploid variations. And they've actually done research and showed that there's heavy amounts of variations for allergenicity between certain variations of wheat. And so what they're finding is, depending on which variation you have growing, it totally does make a difference in the amount of influence on allergenicity, depending on what you're breeding. So there are variations. And then lastly, scientists are starting to actually try to create a safe celiac, we'll call it a celiac safe wheat. But my worry is, are we going to see way less protein? Are we going to see the actual nutritional component be taken away just to consume wheat? And is wheat even something you should be wanting to consume anyway? And so I would argue that there's way more information that we should be getting, because we eat a lot of hybridized wheat in the United States. It's not so common across in Europe. And some people argue that it's getting harder and harder for us to digest wheat as a society. And I think most people know if they're having stomach issues or other issues with their body, the first thing that they would cut out, if you would ask someone, it would be, well, maybe it's gluten. Like, I think a lot of people know it's the first place to start.
Yep.
So that's just something that I think, there are things that we can tie to that. I think there's more information we would want, but ultimately, I think more and more people are finding themselves intolerant to gluten, and I think more and more people are finding themselves have celiac disease. And whether that is strictly only from eating wheat, or that people are having more issues, or is it just the health of the country as a whole getting worse? Now we're just not able to digest certain foods. I don't know, but it's something that we should have more information on.
It's actually promising that we can see the specific like the glia alpha 9 and some of these other small things from a research standpoint that we can actually tie it to, not just retrospective studies.
Right.
And okay, we consumed this for this long, looking back, how did it do? From a scientific standpoint, it's promising that we can kind of see where some of the root causes are coming from.
And I think it's important as a society who is only getting sicker, having more digestive issues. Some people are miserable when it comes to what they can and cannot consume. So other hybridized crops would be soy. Soy is heavily hybridized. A lot of people, soy can be a known allergen for them, and it could be, even just organic soy. Some people just really have an issue with soy. There was a study by the EFSA found that GM soybeans had allergenic potential similar to non-GMO soy. The concerns are more on residual herbicides and glyphosate versus the actual GMO soy. So they're arguing that the allergenicity is coming from the residual of pesticide use, not so much the genetic modification. Regardless, it's still a problem, and at least they're pointing that out.
So true. And to take another perspective as well, because I have a couple dogs at home, a lot of their foods, treats have soy in them. They have all these other probably genetically modified organisms, GMOs. So, if obviously, if your pets are part of your family, you also want to look at it from that perspective, not just for human consumption, but also for your
animals.
pets as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll notice most pets thrive on a type of diet that is tailored to that too, obviously. I know it's tough to feed animals a whole food diet, actual food diet, and not obviously bought, but there are some companies out there that do a really good job at creating a better organic, we'll call it a meal or food for them.
Yes.
You just kind of have to do your digging. I'm not sure of any companies. It's been a while since I've had to buy dog food, but
Yeah, Morgan and I, we make our dog's food from scratch with some kibble as well, like on a weekly basis. So it's...
And that makes a difference.
Oh, absolutely. Energy-wise, for sure.
I'll kind of go into a few more. There's a few that I put on here, and we may put it up for everybody, but
For sure.
peanuts is another one. There so far has been no direct link between hybridization and increased allergenicity, but allergen levels definitely vary between certain peanut varieties. Lastly, corn. Some animal studies have raised concerns about genetically modified corn's impact on gut microbiota and immune responses, but apparently in human studies it has not been confirmed yet.
I don't believe that at all.
I went into rice, canola, tomatoes, celery, apples. Kind of found the same thing. They find concerns, but we really have yet to. It's all poorly studied, or it has been just, hidden.
I wonder who are doing those and funding those studies.
Who knows?
That's where you got to look at.
But it's just something that you need to think about.
Yes.
Do we have all the information, and could there be a possibility that we don't? And if we really don't, what should you be doing to protect yourself? That's really where I think I want people who are listening to understand that.
Yes. So, Doc, I know we've heard this word glyphosate before. Well, let's dive into what are the health implications that this can have on our body, and how is this brought into the perspective of these GMOs, organic, non-organic? What does that perspective look like, and how does it affecting, more importantly, us and our bodies?
Yes. So the glyphosate was primarily used on what are called Roundup Ready crops. And Roundup is a chemical brand that was invented to basically, what glyphosate, it's an herbicide. So when it's sprayed on crops, it kills weeds, it kills plants. Now, Roundup Ready crops are genetically modified to be resistant to glyphosate. So when you spray them on your crops, it doesn't harm your crop. It only kills the weeds. And this was a huge, huge invention. I mean, this really changed a lot of the ways that we sprayed and managed crop and our yields. Like, it made it very easy to produce, high amounts of crops, kill as many weeds as possible, and you only had to do it with one chemical. Now the problem was resistance. People didn't understand that plants are smart, and they developed the same genes that the crops did. Wow. And they became resistant to glyphosate. And now you have to spray either a tremendous amount, or you're switching and having to spray other things on the weeds in order to kill them.
Wow.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yes.
Another mic
So
drop.
glyphosate is basically, it targets an enzyme in our bacteria in our body. And so just as if the glyphosate were to go onto the plant biota and kill it, it can absolutely go into our microbial biota. And that's where people get confused. It's not necessarily targeting things that we have in our body, but it's absolutely targeting our microbiota in our stomach lining. So,
Yes.
and there are definitely other things that it can do, but that's kind of the big one that we associate with, is the change in microbiota. So the same pathway that it affects in the plant, it does affect in our gut bacteria. It leads to dysbiosis. It can lead to production of what are called short-chain fatty acids, which are critical for gut and metabolic health. It also increases intestinal permeability, also known as leaky gut, which allows inflammatory molecules and toxins to enter the bloodstream. So that's something that we know pretty well in literature of what glyphosate does to the body, but there are other things that people don't realize that it does, and that would be endocrine disrupting or interfering with our hormones. It has been shown to alter estrogen and androgen signaling pathways in the body. It can create inflammation. It can change our DNA or damage our DNA. It has, in animal studies, shown concerns on our reproductive health. It can be neurotoxic. It can be liver and kidney toxic.
Oh my God.
And lastly, it has been shown to increase risk of cancer. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So, regulatory agencies like the EPA and the EFSA argue that glyphosate is safe when used as directed. Other organizations classify it as a probable carcinogen for humans. However, there is debate around exposure levels, and particularly agriculture workers versus the general population, because they obviously are around it a lot more. And so some argue that there's different exposure levels, and that's really why they're getting in. And it's not, it's better, it's safe for consumption, but if you're a farmer who's using it, that's actually who's at risk, and it's not actually the person who's eating it. Like,
They're tiptoeing around
it is, and
this so bad.
it's unfortunate because I'll get to that here in a little bit. But so 2019, University of Washington did a study and showed that glyphosate can increase the risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma by over 40%. However, the EPA raised concerns about it because they said the methodology of the studies suggested that when actually adjusted for the proper rates, there wasn't really an association, and it wasn't very statistically significant.
Who's paying them to put that in there?
Also, the Journal of Cancer showed several pesticides, including glyphosate, being linked to increased risk of prostate cancer. The study analyzed pesticide data and found associations both with prostate and increased mortality rate. Systematic review in 2021 showed increased risk of reproductive health in glyphosate. Again, I talked about neurotoxicity. Yeah, I kind of feel like I hit my nail on the head there. But this is where I think in the timeline of things it started to get interesting, and that was in 2022. So, like I said, Bayer is the company that owns Monsanto, who started Roundup. Roundup is a Monsanto product. Bayer in 2022 settled over 100,000 Roundup lawsuits, paying approximately $11 billion to these individuals who were, quote unquote, either harmed or had cancer or all these other issues that they had basically shown from being around Roundup. Despite the 100,000 that were settled in 2022, there are still around 30,000 that they believe are remaining, and I'm sure it's building every day. And we don't know that these are happening. They're all done in silent court. They're being paid off. It's like, okay, you come to court, you get your money, leave. You come to court, get your money, leave. We don't know these are happening, but it is. Since 2022, there's been over 100,000 Roundup lawsuits being paid out. Now, one of them that was pretty interesting was one in Philadelphia, and this gentleman was awarded $78 million because he claimed that his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was caused by Roundup.
That was recent. This was
in
months
2024. Bayer, was a statement that they put out after they paid the $78 million. They expressed disagreement with the verdict, and they cited that there was conflicting scientific evidence and regulatory consensus.
Scientific research.
They said that we just feel that we were not given a fair trial, and that this man was just coming at us because for whatever, trying to get money.
Wow.
But we know studies have shown an increase in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I think it's pretty simple to see the correlation across the board for what happened to this gentleman. So I just wanted to pick out kind of one specific lawsuit that I thought was interesting out of the hundreds of thousands that have been put in so far. Lastly, 2024, the U.S. Court of Appeals for Third Circuit ruled in Bayer's favor, stating that federal law preempted state law claims regarding failure to warn about cancer risks on Roundup labels. This decision contrasts with rulings from other circuits, potentially setting the stage for the U.S. Supreme Court involvement and to resolve these discrepancies. So in 2024, I think it was, we're going to see what further litigations now are, but
Yeah.
Bayer now basically argued that we can't be sued anymore because it was actually the state law's inability to warn about cancer risks of Roundup labels.
Wow.
Yeah. Even though it was our product, you didn't do a very good job of arguing that it was not healthy for use.
That is ridiculous.
Yeah. So they're doing everything that they absolutely can to basically stop paying people money for the cancer that they gave these individuals.
I didn't realize how deep this went from an environmental standpoint, from food consumption. It's kind of putting a whole, it's coming full circle to say the least.
Yeah.
But okay, so we know that in America. Okay, how does it look like in other countries?
Well, there was one more that was
please.
interesting. This was in Australia. The federal court dismissed a class action lawsuit involving 800 people alleged Roundup caused their non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Okay.
Justice Michael Lee concluded the evidence did not support the claims that glyphosate-based products increase the risk of developing NHL, and so he dismissed the case, and they didn't have to pay. So we're seeing it on both ends.
Interesting.
We're seeing it on both ends. Some people are not getting their, what I would consider their fair trial, and others
Yes.
are. So
Interesting.
final case closure in 2025. The Court of Australia closed their last pending case. This was a month ago.
Yeah.
Or no, this is this month,
This
basically.
month, yeah, at the beginning.
They closed their last case concerning Roundup's alleged carcinogenicity, marking a significant legal victory for Bayer. And that was coming off of that one trial, I believe. I think there was a few more after that. And they dismissed it, basically saying that there's no real evidence to show that glyphosate caused these cancers. And that was for Australia. So what that now looks for in Australia is anybody who comes to the courts with an NHL and argues that it was Roundup that caused it. Since a federal court already has made a ruling on this, they're going to use this
And then go back
to
it.
argue
Yep.
further forward. And this now, it probably closed off all other litigations for Bayer in that region.
Which would make sense.
Yeah.
Wow. Mic drop again.
And that's all I got, man.
That
That's all I got on this issue that I've been a part of, my whole life. I grew up around farms. I worked on farms. Farmers are some of the most incredible individuals, the hardest working individuals. I have nothing bad to say about farmers. If they were given a miracle chemical that didn't harm any humans, that gave them the best yield, they'd use it. They don't care.
Yes.
They just want to help people. They want to help people like we want to help people. It's an incredibly rewarding profession when you work hard and you get this yield and you can provide. Like, I don't know. There's a lot more to it than people argue. I would not ever once argue that it's the farmer.
Definitely not.
People just need to quit with that argument. It's these agencies, these companies, and these entities that control the production, that controls the manufacturing, controls the technology, controls all of it. And farmers don't really have a say. They don't. I mean, you could try your hardest to try to be an organic farmer, but when when you've only done what you've, generationally been shown through history, and this is how you know how to make a living, it's a lot of risk to go and change up what you've been doing for 50 years.
Thousands,
Yeah.
probably maybe a couple
Even
million
hundreds of
dollars
years in these
to
older
switch.
farm families. So, I'm for that, and I argue that that's really the issue. It's really how can, as a society, we make the farmer's job easier, and how do we make the lives of the people in this country healthier and better? And it's going to come from changing a lot of the issues that we've had with chemicals, pesticides, tracking, literature. Do we have the full information? Do we understand everything fully? That's really where I think we're going to really make a difference. But it's going to take more than the Trump administration to do that, unfortunately.
Very true.
But I'm hopeful. We'll see what happens.
Absolutely. As long as people have the information, the awareness, I think that it's a good starting spot.
Yeah.
From there. And Doc, I really appreciate you for putting all this knowledge and your experience into this whole episode. I think it'll only benefit so many people moving forward from there. So I appreciate you for that.
We'll see if we get censored. Hopefully, everybody listening can share this. We're going to try to promote it like we do with every podcast, but most of the ones we do ends up getting caught somewhere in the jail of YouTube and or other platforms. So again, we just appreciate each and every one of you that has been listening. We hope this was valuable for you. A lot of what we talked about today really came from a place of effort to put forth this information. We've really tried to make sure that everything we've talked about today was from a fair point, but we know that there are issues that comes with this industry, and we just want to make sure that everybody who has questions and concerns about this really knows where to go from here. So please like, share, subscribe. We thank you guys again for watching, and until next time, you guys have a great day.
Ooh, let's go. That was a terrible move.
That's all right.
Disclaimer, the content provided in this health podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or 911 immediately. Reliance on any information provided in this podcast is solely at your own risk. The creators and hosts of this podcast are not responsible for any actions or decisions you may take based on the information presented.
Thanks for joining us on The Functional Code. For more evidence-based health insights, subscribe, rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. Remember, your journey to a healthier you begins with understanding the Functional Code. Until next time, stay well, stay informed, and embrace the science of living well.